20 years ago, the Watergate scandal rocked the nation. But tonight we can reveal that the target was not known to the investigative committees, nor even to G. Gordon Liddy, who ran the break-in team. Indeed, Larry O'Brien's office was never bugged. Buried in the National Archives until now is evidence that could unlock the mystery. It is this key. One of the burglars risked his life to conceal it. Was it the key to the real target of the break-in? Was it the key to a call girl ring with sinister underworld connections? What was the real role of John Dean, the counsel to President Nixon, who turned state's evidence in return for a minimal sentence?
Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself. Thank you very much.
A prophetic comment in an emotional goodbye to his staff from Richard Nixon, a president ruined by a scandal that need never to have touched him. By the time he left the White House in disgrace, the suffix "gate" had already been added to the English language to signify a major political scandal.
There's the president waving goodbye. You hear the applause.
When 5 burglars were caught at the Watergate building in Washington 20 years ago, they unleashed the most destructive political scandal in the history of the United States. The building was the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, and the burglars were in the pay of their Republican opponents, specifically the campaign to re-elect the president. 12 men went to jail for the burglary and the cover-up. They included Nixon's 2 chief White House aides, H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, and former Attorney General John Mitchell. Nixon avoided jail, but he lost the presidency. "I hereby resign the office of President of the United States," was his one-sentence abdication. Watergate is seared in American political history, but many fundamental beliefs surrounding it are quite simply wrong. Even those directly involved in investigating the scandal still don't know answers to crucial questions.
I must tell you that I remain disturbed by what we don't know about the Watergate break-in, and I am convinced that what we don't know about the Watergate break-in may well be more important than what we do know about it 20 years after.
20 years ago, the Nixon administration was under siege. The White House was fighting wars on 2 fronts, in Vietnam and in the streets. This was a White House where legal counsel John Dean could prepare an official enemies list, suggesting that they use federal machinery to screw our political enemies, and have the chief of the White House staff approve it. The burglars were led by G. Gordon Liddy, an ex-FBI agent. He loyally went to jail for his political masters, admitting nothing. Now he has a story to tell, and what a story.
It was to get sexual dirt, if you will, on the Democrats. And from what we have now learned, there was plenty there to be had.
We'll hear more about the allegation that Watergate was motivated by a desire to get sexual dirt on the Democrats later on in the program. The 5 burglars Liddy commanded were all ex-CIA operatives. 4 were Cubans, who all fought in the abortive Bay of Pigs operation against Fidel Castro. Frank Sturgis, the leader of the Cubans, remembers how he was recruited for the Watergate break-in.
Evidently, the president felt that there were so much leaks in the FBI, there were so much leaks in the National Security Agency, there were so many leaks that were coming out of the White House itself, plus the leaks that were coming out of CIA, and he wanted to plug up these leaks. He wanted to find out who was leaking confidential information to the press. That was our job. And that the Special Intelligence Unit had more power than a lot of these agencies had. And this is where the news media came up with the idea, calling us the plumbers, to plug up the leaks.
For all their CIA connections, the plumbers were incompetent burglars. 3 members of the Washington Police Undercover, or so-called Bum Squad, responded to a robbery in progress. They found the burglars and piles of photographic equipment, film, all sorts of electronic gear, and hordes of cash. But later, the police found something that was much more interesting. In fact, it was political dynamite. The address book of one of the burglars, Bernard Barker, included the listing HH for Howard Hunt and the initials WH, White House. It was the first indication that the White House was behind the break-in. From the phone at the 2nd Precinct, one of the detectives made an anonymous call tipping off the Washington Post. Watergate had begun.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it.
John Dean is remembered as the young man who mesmerized a nation by his seeming encyclopedic memory, which so damaged the Nixon presidency. Day after day, the nation stood glued to the television as he spoke, watched by his beautiful blonde wife, Mo. Dean was the chief witness before the Senate committee, an insider who turned state's evidence in return for a minimal sentence.
The president was well aware of what had been going on regarding the success of keeping the White House out of the Watergate scandal, and I had also expressed to him my concern that I was not confident that the cover-up could be maintained indefinitely.
John Dean, more than anyone, revealed the massive White House cover-up, a cover-up in which he had played an active role. Dean told how he had discussed payments to the Watergate burglars with President Nixon.
I told him I didn't know much about it, other than the fact that the money was laundered, so it could not be traced, and then there were secret deliveries.
But some government officials now think that Dean knew a whole lot more than he let on. They believe his role in the cover-up was so pervasive, it fatally flawed their own investigation, so they never found out what really happened. The FBI set up a special team to investigate Watergate, but almost everywhere they went, John Dean had been there before. Angelo Leno was the FBI special agent in the Washington field office responsible for the Watergate investigation. Leno is now retired, but he still acts as an FBI consultant.
We had no idea that John Dean was getting the information. And what John Dean was doing with the information was circumventing our investigation. Every avenue that we tried, John was either there or was about to approach somebody, debrief them, and I don't know exactly what he said to them, whether he told them, don't say this and don't say that.
Much to the disgust of Angelo Leno, Dean was intimately involved. Leno later learned that Dean was working closely with the acting director of the FBI, Pat Gray, to cover up the White House involvement in Watergate. Gray admitted giving evidence to Dean, and also of destroying evidence by throwing it into the Potomac River.
What was happening was the acting director then, Pat Gray, insisted that certain material that we were gathering during the course of the investigation be made available to him either on a daily basis or every 7 days in the form of a report. And that report would consist of hundreds of documents. Unbeknownst to us, at the time what was happening was he was furnishing the results of interviews that were being conducted all over the country, as well as in the D.C. area, to John Dean. And of course, John Dean knew every step that we were about to take.
Seymour Glanzer was one of the original Watergate prosecutors. This was the team which investigated and prosecuted the burglary and cover-ups for the federal courts. Glanzer, too, believes Dean actually obstructed the government's investigation.
The FBI traditionally has always conducted interviews without counsel being present. If Dean was at an interview, he would have claimed to have been there as counsel. And of course, he should not have been there because he was deeply involved in the investigation and was really, as it turns out, to be a central figure in the conspiracy.
Gordon Liddy is a man of black and white, rigid beliefs. He was the head of the Watergate burglary team, and he totally believed in Richard Nixon. Liddy's refusal to talk to the prosecutors and the Senate Watergate Committee earned him the longest prison sentence of any of the Watergate defendants, 5 years and 4 months, a longer term than some rapists. He now claims John Dean recruited him for dirty tricks.
I was recruited for the entire Watergate operation by John Dean. I told him that an all-out offensive and defensive political intelligence plan for that period of time would be very expensive. And Mr. Dean then said, how about $500,000 for openers? And I said, that's approximately correct because it will probably take a full $1,000,000 by the time you're through. And he said, there's no problem in that kind of money.
Sam Irvin, the chairman of the Special Investigating Committee, pounding for order, and the second day of the hearings.
The Watergate Committee gave John Dean immunity from prosecution for his testimony because of his apparent cooperation with them. The reliance on Dean's evidence skewed the investigation. It shifted the focus away from the motive for the break-in to the issue of the president's involvement in the cover-up. Howard Liebengood is a prominent Washington attorney now. But 20 years ago, he was a Senate Watergate counsel and became a leading figure on Capitol Hill as Sergeant-at-Arms of the United States Senate.
That I think the committee gave short shrift to examining the genuine motives for the break-in thoroughly. They sort of accepted the story that this was purely a political operation, that it was designed to target Larry O'Brien, etc., and didn't focus on the details of the actual break-in and its motives. The committee rushed to the issue of cover-up and what the president knew, when he knew it, etc., as you know. And while that was certainly a most appropriate inquiry and probably the most relevant inquiry, they hastened to get to that point without spending, in my opinion, as much investigative time and attention to detail with regard to the break-in itself as they might have and should have. Had they done so, it is possible that some of these things that are now surprising revelations, such as the key, might have been discovered.
This is the key to Watergate. It could unlock the real reason for the break-in. It is probably the most important evidence not seen by the Watergate Committee or the federal prosecutors. Astonishingly, its existence was not even known about until recently. For 20 years, it had been buried at the National Archives. It looked like an ordinary key, and it is. It is the key to the desk of a secretary at the Democratic National Committee. A key that may have been able to unlock vital secrets inside that desk. It was found during the arrest of the burglars, when one of them risked his life to hide it. What makes this even more mysterious is that this particular plumber was one of the CIA's most highly trained experts in illegal entry. He knew the consequences of reaching into his jacket pocket, the likely place for a weapon, as 3 nervous cops had their guns drawn on him. Now, 20 years later, some of the people most directly involved in the Watergate investigation, with access to all evidence in the case, even secret testimony never revealed to the public, are shocked that they never knew anything about this key and the circumstances under which it was discovered.
I didn't know anything about that key. I've only heard about it since I spoke to you last. It's a surprising thing to me, and I understand that there may be some other theory linked to that key and so forth.
The Senate Watergate Committee, which spent months on public hearings and its own classified investigations, also knew nothing about the key. It was as much in the dark about this vital piece of evidence as the Watergate prosecutors.
I think the existence of the key itself is one of the most important new elements of information, items of evidence, to come to my attention at least.
Counsel called the first witness.
Yes, is it Officer Schaffler?
Detective Carl Schaffler, the plainclothes intelligence officer, was one of 3 arresting policemen during the Watergate break-in.
I really do believe, as simple as this may sound, we wouldn't be sitting around again with all the puzzles and all the mysteries had we taken the time to find out exactly what that key would lead us to. And obviously it was overlooked.
And what particular outfit or unit were you assigned to?
2nd District Tactical Squad Unit.
It was Schaffler who actually found the key. He noticed one of the Watergate burglars, Eugenio Rolando Martinez, acting suspiciously while he was being searched during the arrest.
He was at the extreme left portion of the line, and he made a motion with his hand toward the chest area. I glanced at him, noticed it, and placed his hand back on the wall in a forceful way. I told him to keep his hands on the wall. I went back to assisting Officer Barrett by listing property that was being taken individually from each of the subjects when I again noticed that Martinez was not complying with the directive he had been given and again was going into that chest area. And in a very forceful manner, he was placed back against the wall. There was a brief struggle with him over him trying to do something in that chest area. Now, bear in mind, we had already patted him for weapons. It was at that particular time, the second time, I thought maybe somehow we had missed something. So I reached into the area he was going to and pulled out a notebook with a key on it.
Schaffler found the key taped to a yellow spiral notebook in Martinez's breast pocket. That night, all the Cubans were using pseudonyms. Martinez was Jean Valdez. These are Schaffler's own notes from 20 years ago of the evidence taken from Jean Valdez. The bottom clearly says, yellow spiral notebook with key. Schaffler initialed the top right corner of the notebook, CMS, and dated it June 17th, 1972. This key and this notebook, buried for 2 decades in the vaults of the National Archives in Washington, were taken from Eugenio Rolando Martinez during his arrest. These days, Valdez, or rather Martinez, is a used car salesman in Miami, where our producers caught up with him. His comments were not recorded, as the state of Florida prohibits recording without permission. This once legendary CIA field operative, nicknamed Muscalito, or Little Muscle Man, now denies any knowledge of the key. But Detective Schaffler says Martinez almost died because of it.
We were nervous. We had our guns drawn. And in the face of this, he failed to follow our directions at least twice, and the last time could have cost him his life.
Watergate burglar Frank Sturgis also vividly remembers the scuffle between Martinez and Schaffler.
Martinez started talking because he told everybody to shut up, get up against the wall, and so forth, and Martinez started blah, 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 and he slapped the hell out of Martinez. It was a shame. I don't know, he shouldn't have done that, you know. And then I spoke up. I says, hey, look, fellas, take it easy. Nobody's going to hurt you. Calm down, okay? We don't have no weapons, no nothing. Don't get excited. We're not out to hurt nobody, and please, don't hurt none of us. Because he slapped the hell out of Martinez, and I didn't like it.
10 days after the break-in, the FBI discovered what that key unlocked. The FBI thought it important enough to find out what this key fit. They spent hours trying dozens of locks until they made the match. The Bureau's confidential 302s, or raw investigation records, revealed that the key fit the desk of Ida Maxine Wells. There is no evidence to suggest that Ida Maxine Wells herself knew why one of the burglars had the key. She was a secretary in a suite of offices that had been bugged 2 weeks earlier. But there is no doubt that her desk was the real target of the Watergate burglars, and none of the committees on Capitol Hill knew that. Forgotten in the popular lore of Watergate was an earlier successful break-in, which went completely undetected. 20 days before the famous Watergate burglary, the same team of so-called plumbers slipped into the building. They bugged a telephone in the Democratic National Committee. It was the phone near the desk of Ida Maxine Wells.
Every individual that I was introduced to or that was pointed out to me, I was advised this is a White House consultant.
One of the Watergate plumbers, Alfred Baldwin, had been monitoring the bugged phone for 2 weeks from the Howard Johnson Hotel across the street. The bugged conversations were alleged to be of a sexual nature. But during the Watergate trials, the evidence from the wiretap was sealed by the courts at the request of the Democrats who had been bugged.
We had a witness on the stand, Baldwin, who was testifying that they had electronic devices in there to record conversations, and he was, in a general way, going to say that they related to social relationships between people, without getting into whether there was even any sexual connotation or any other connotation to it.
Just what does this have to do with the next and famous Watergate break-in? As it turns out, plenty. The Washington paper's banner headline tells of the busting of a call girl ring at the Columbia Plaza across the street from the Watergate. It's June 9th, just 10 days after the first Watergate break-in. A lawyer, Philip Mackin Bailey, is arrested and charged with violating prostitution laws.
The operation at Columbia Plaza sent a number of girls down to the Watergate to service various clientele at the Watergate. There were arrests made in the lobby of the Watergate Hotel from this ring.
That same day, June 9th, an official White House pass shows that a John Rudy visits John Dean at his office. Time is 15:50, 3:50 p.m. Rudy was the Justice Department official prosecuting the call girl ring. Dean had apparently telephoned earlier and specifically asked Rudy to come over. Rudy wouldn't discuss the meeting for this report, but he did with another former Justice Department colleague. In fact, Rudy and Benton Becker had a number of conversations about it. Benton Becker was counsel to Gerald Ford, and he was the man who negotiated President Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon. Becker says Rudy was very clear about the day he was summoned to the White House to see John Dean.
That is a momentous event. That is a momentous event, and one that one does not forget very quickly if one is a local prosecutor and receives a telephone call from the counsel to the President of the United States. Dean told Rudy to bring with him the evidence that had been seized from Phil Bailey's home or his apartment and his law office. Most unusual request. Assistant United States Attorney Rudy speaking to the counsel to the President of the United States.
Becker says Rudy and Rudy's boss, Don Smith, took to the White House 2 personal telephone directories seized from Bailey. Efforts were made to verify the details of this extraordinary story with both John Dean and John Rudy, but neither would talk. But during his interview with Rudy, Becker took notes, which he made available. Becker also confirmed the story with Don Smith, who went on to be a judge in Washington, D.C.
Dean then called in his secretary and instructed her to take the 2 telephone directories and to Xerox them. She did, and subsequently returned with the originals and the Xerox copies. The Xerox copies were retained by Dean, and all originals were returned to Mr. Rudy and Mr. Smith. John Rudy told me that he, of course, had close contact with that book, not only on that occasion, but
subsequently throughout the Bailey prosecution, that he recollected and remembered that a notation in Phil Bailey's book was the notation Mo, M-O, Biner, B-I-N-E-R, I believe.
Mo Biner was John Dean's girlfriend, shortly to become his wife. It has not been possible to confirm independently that her name was in the address books. Mo Dean's alleged inclusion isn't proof of anything. Other prominent Washingtonians were also allegedly listed in Bailey's address book. The entire file on the Bailey Columbia Plaza case is missing from government archives. This call girl ring was being investigated by Detective Schaffler.
I became aware in conducting investigations that there was a prostitution ring that operated out of Columbia Plaza, which is approximately a block from the Watergate.
The Columbia Plaza call girl ring particularly interested Detective Schaffler because he says it involved the leading mafia boss in Washington, Joseph Francis Nesline.
He had a very close female associate whom they identified as Heidi. And they told me that Heidi was a former stripper and that she was had a reputation for being a party girl and for being involved in at various times in various levels of prostitution activity. They further went on to tell me that Heidi Riken was also a very, very close friend of a girl and a roommate of a girl whom they identified to me as Mo, the wife of the counsel to the president, John Dean.
There are several photographs of Heidi Riken with Joseph Nesline and with his wife, Josephine Alvarez.
Now, not only was Heidi a roommate of Mo Dean's, but in fact I received similar information concerning his wife, Josephine Alvarez, and that earlier, before their marriage, Josephine Alvarez shared an apartment with Mo Dean and Heidi Riken.
In her book, Mo, A Woman's View of Watergate, Mo Dean has several references to her close friend, Heidi Riken. At Mo's wedding to John Dean, Heidi Riken stands behind her, fixing her hair.
The implication that one of Nesline's underlings could have a relationship with a girl who, in effect, had the ear of the president's counsel concerned me. Mr. Nesline has been identified as the protege of Meyer Lansky, the king of organized crime. Now, Meyer Lansky made a statement once that someday they, meaning organized crime, would put a man in the White House and he wouldn't even know it. Well, it's chilling to me that Mr. Nesline could have a close female associate such as Heidi Riken, and in fact she could be the roommate of the counsel to the President of the United States, his girlfriend, Mo. I think that knowing how organized crime operates and knowing what type of an individual that Nesline himself was and who he associated with, it's inconceivable to me that he wouldn't have made some attempt to take advantage of this situation in some way. Now, whether or not he did, I have no real strong basis to make that conclusion. But I think, again, those questions should have been asked and should be asked.
How do these strands connect? What was the relationship between this call girl operation and the Democratic National Committee? Len Kolodny has researched the unanswered questions of Watergate for 7 years. He wrote the bestseller Silent Coup about the scandal with co-author Bob Getlin. Now living in Tampa, Florida, Kolodny is still pursuing the answers to Watergate. Kolodny's thesis that the call girl ring stretched right to the heart of the Democratic National Committee is both sensational and controversial.
During the term of that call girl ring being in existence, one of the places they set up in early 1972 was a branch office at the Democratic National Committee. You'd come in and you'd use code names and so on and so forth, and there would be pictures of the girls, and the men would be shown pictures. They'd pick a girl, and a phone call would be made to the Columbia Plaza, and that girl would be made available, sort of an escort for the night.
For 20 years, it's been thought that the mission of the burglars was to obtain political intelligence about the Democrats, by bugging the phone of Larry O'Brien, chairman of the Democratic National Committee. But the evidence points in another direction. No bug was ever found in O'Brien's office.
I was going in these windows, into these offices, turning the lights on. That's when Baldwin was...
Detective John Barrett is the officer who discovered the burglars, while his partners were searching in another part of the Democratic National Committee.
We're standing in Lawrence O'Brien's office right now, who at the time was the chairman of the Democratic National Committee back in '72. Many people believe this to be the original target of the break-in, this office here. However, no burglars were found in here, no listening devices, nothing. This room was clean.
Directly across the street from the Watergate complex is the Howard Johnson's Hotel. From room 723 of the hotel, Alfred Baldwin monitored the phone conversations from the bugged phone. Today, the three Watergate cops can stand on the balcony and look across the street at the target of both burglaries. Room 723 looks directly into the suite of offices where the phone was bugged and where the desk matched Martinez's key. The phone bug needed a line-of-sight recorder. It could transmit through the window glass of the bugged offices, but not through the walls. At the far end of the Watergate building, and in no way visible from the lookout, is the supposed target, Larry O'Brien's office. All this came as a shock to Gordon Liddy, the chief of the Watergate burglars. He went to jail believing his team had bugged O'Brien's office for political information. He now thinks he was duped.
The orders I received were to break into the office of Larry O'Brien, who was then the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and to put in two bugs, one on his telephone to monitor those conversations, and the other a room bug to monitor any conversations in the room, and to photograph anything that was lying about. Those are the instructions that I gave to Mr. Hunt. Those instructions were not carried out. Someone had countermanded them. They didn't go anywhere near Mr. O'Brien's office. In fact, they went to the 4-button telephone that was in the office of Ida Maxine Wells.
We can only speculate as to what was in the drawer of Ida Maxine Wells' desk that was so important that another burglary may have been set up to get it.
Without placing any fault in terms of the FBI's investigation, I clearly now believe that had the key been taken to the desk and the contents of that desk viewed, a lot of our mysteries and questions about Watergate, in particular burglary motive, might have been answered.
Nobody can prove what was in the desk that night because the desk never got opened. And until the desk is opened by somebody that night, it would have had to have been within minutes to know for sure, because it leaves the whole problem of time frames. People could have gotten in and removed what was in the desk. What we know is the desk was the target.
But who was behind the break-in? Who wanted the information, whatever it was, that was in the desk? Again, we can only speculate, but Gordon Liddy is certain he was set up to get it by John Dean.
It was clear that I served as what we say in the intelligence services as a cutout.
Cutout being?
A circuit breaker between John Dean and John Dean's baby, which was Watergate.
And who was the true leader of the Watergate break-in?
Well, John Dean was the true leader.
Why would John Dean have been involved? Author Len Kolodny has developed his own theory.
John Dean ran the entire operation. He ran the first operation. Remember, he's the guy who hired G. Gordon Liddy. So he ran both. First to get sexual dirt for himself, and then to protect himself. That's what happened. First break-in to get sexual dirt, second break-in to find out whether he had a problem or not.
John and Mo Dean now live quietly in California. They were offered the opportunity to discuss the issues raised in this program, but they refused.
'Cause I don't want to be involved in anything that has to do with the Watergate break-in. I don't want to be involved in anything that has to do with the Watergate break-in. I don't want to be involved in anything that has to do with the Watergate break-in. I don't want to be involved in anything that has to do with the Watergate break-in. I don't want to be involved in anything that has to do with the Watergate break-in. I don't want to be involved in anything that has to do with the Watergate break-in. I don't want to be involved in anything that has to do with the Watergate break-in. I don't want to be involved in anything that has to do with the Watergate break-in. I don't want to be involved in anything that has to do with the Watergate break-in. I don't want to be involved in anything that has to do with the Watergate break-in. I don't want to be involved in anything that has to do with the Watergate break-in. I don't want to be involved in anything that has to do with the Watergate bre
We do know that they flatly reject the version of events which Gordon Liddy and others have provided. The Deans have sued Liddy, Arthur Kolodny, and others in a $50 million libel suit, but not before Liddy had taunted the Deans on his Washington radio program.
And it is WJFK, and I'm G. Gordon Liddy. We are starting the program, and we have a bulletin. Those of you who are loyal listeners will remember that I have been broadcasting the address of this station, where I can be found by any process server that has been retained by John Dean.
Ironically, the libel suit may serve to reopen the investigation.
Actually, the lawsuit is one of the more fortunate circumstances in American history from my point of view, because, you see, the statute of limitations on Mr. Dean's massive and serial perjury back in the 70s had long since run. There was nothing that could be done to rectify that. By bringing this lawsuit, he now puts himself in the position of allowing us to put him back under oath.
This is Gordon Liddy's own personal belief, but the battlefield will be the courtroom.
I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
If not a crook, an active co-conspirator who paid the price for a massive misuse of power. Nixon's paranoia elevated what started as a third-rate burglary about which he knew nothing into a political time bomb which blew his presidency apart.
I don't believe that he did know about it when it occurred, but you see, the problem with the cover-up is this. People cover up things for other reasons. In this case, it would be political reasons, and they get caught up and drawn into a criminal obstruction of justice.
Well, you had this paranoid Richard Nixon, this introvert who had stored up all these grudges, who could never get them out of his craw. So, obviously, we want to check everything out with him.
Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Jack Anderson was, along with the Washington Post, hot on the Watergate trail.
And he was surrounded by young men who had no experience, who knew only that he was President of the United States, and who, in the manner of young men, tended to ape their chief and even magnify his attitudes and his complaints.
Jack Anderson was probably the journalist most hated and feared by the Nixon White House. He was investigated by the Pentagon, the IRS, the FBI, and even the CIA in complete violation of U.S. law. These are the thousands of pages of CIA surveillance documents on Anderson which he received under the Freedom of Information Act. The CIA's illegal surveillance was called Project Mudhen. Anderson was assigned the code name Brandy.
I headed Richard Nixon's enemies list, probably for alphabetical reasons, but on the other hand, I think I was probably more investigated than anyone else on his enemies list. As I said, the private investigator, the plumbers, the FBI, the CIA, the Pentagon, and every other law enforcement agency, the Internal Revenue Service, looked at my taxes for 2 years, though my accountant said that they should have been able to satisfy themselves in 24 hours because my records were very complete. They were looking for dirt. They were looking for something to try to discredit me. They were trying to pin a crime on me.
But journalist Jack Anderson wasn't only harassed by the Nixon White House. He was targeted for assassination. And his hunter was G. Gordon Liddy. Liddy says he coordinated the hit with E. Howard Hunt, White House security consultant and ex-CIA station chief in Mexico.
Mr. Hunt came to me and said that Jack Anderson had now gone too far in that he had identified one of our human intelligence assets posted abroad, who as a result of that, if he was not already dead, was dying under torture. And he said that he had been instructed to meet with me and a Dr. Gunn, assassination expert of the Central Intelligence Agency, and that meeting's object was to guarantee, that was the operative word, that Mr. Anderson would not repeat that conduct. Well, the only way you can guarantee that someone will not do something is to kill them. And we agreed that that was the only thing possible. And we then had a conversation on the various techniques and mechanics to effect that. And then we drew that up, and it was submitted by Mr. Hunt to his superiors in the White House, and Mr. Hunt subsequently reported back to me that he was told that is too severe a sanction, don't do it, so of course we did not.
This nightmarish story is almost too gruesome to believe. If Liddy's story is true, and the Nixon White House seriously considered assassinating a political rival, it demonstrates the almost insane paranoia which characterized the Watergate era. Chuck Colson was special counsel to President Nixon and was known as Nixon's dark side. He tried to explain the perceptions from within the Nixon White House that caused their criminal excesses.
Enemies list, all those things could not have happened except in an atmosphere that had almost become paranoid. But one would have had to have lived there during that period of time to understand it. I had left a six-figure law practice to come into the White House because I thought it was my duty to be there. And you end up having a gasoline can thrown onto your car, lighted at night, my limousine bringing me into the White House. You were trapped in the White House weekends by 250,000 kids outside in buses. And the protests, FBI telling us there was somebody on the way to bomb the White House. You really got a paranoid attitude. And then you had, but not paranoia, but not wholly unjustified paranoia. And then you had the Washington Post saying that the Nixon election was like the Nazi occupation of Paris, and getting clobbered in the press day in and day out. And we knew they didn't like Nixon, and we didn't like them back. And so you had this incredible we versus them siege mentality. And only in that kind of a climate, like a humid climate where a fungus can grow, only in that kind of a climate could something like Watergate have happened.
It was a White House removed from reality. 20 years later, Watergate symbolizes the massive abuse of power that caused a sitting president to resign or face removal from office. The irony of the greatest political scandal in U.S. history is that no one knew the purpose of the break-in at the Watergate. This ordinary-looking key could conceivably fit anything, but it fit a desk at the Democratic National Committee, and the burglar who had it risked his life to conceal it from the arresting cops. The desk was in the same group of offices where the only phone bug was ever placed. Shockingly, neither the Senate Watergate Committee nor the Watergate prosecutor ever knew anything about this key. It is almost certain that Richard Nixon never did either. Like a character in a Shakespearean tragedy, Richard Nixon brought about his own downfall. He might have been remembered as a great president had he not been a victim of his own character. As it is, Richard Nixon's place in history is marred by disgrace. He was the Watergate